Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Oliver Money-Curl. I'm head of European advocacy at the International Press Institute, and this is the Media Freedom Rapid Response webinar on reporting on protests amid repression in Turkey, Serbia, and Georgia. Media Freedom Rapid Response, or MFRR, is a consortium of media freedom organisations that include the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, the European Federation of Journalists, Article 19, Free Press Unlimited, Osservatorio Balcani, Ecogozo, Trans-Europa, and the International Press Institute. Together, we monitor media freedom violations, we campaign on individual cases, we advocate for greater protections for journalists and for independent media, and we provide targeted support to journalists in need, such as legal assistance or specialised safety training. The MFRR is funded by the European Commission. This webinar is organised to mark World Press Freedom Day that is celebrated every 3rd of May. And this year, there is little to celebrate, as journalism has never faced a starker challenge than it does today. It is under assault on all sides. Economically, the media revenue model is facing an existential threat, mostly as a result of the digital platform domination of the advertising market, and they're profiting on the back of media content. The rise of generative AI is set to rapidly exacerbate the economic decline of media by using journalist content without compensation and cutting the flow of user traffic that search engines had previously directed to media sites. Once prosperous independent media are now forced to close or to merge, thereby reducing pluralism and creating local news deserts. They are taken over by corporate or political forces, not for profit, but for influence, further undermining their integrity. Disinformation then fills the vacuum left by the retreat of news media, sowing further public mistrust in all media and democratic institutions. Meanwhile, populist politicians seek further to polarize and control the media and the information landscape through capture by using state budgets to reward allies while using regulators to punish their critics. Violence against journalists is on the rise, both online and in the streets, from the public and authorities, who are egged on by the same populist movements that seek to discredit and smear journalism that exposes the corruption in their ranks. Intelligence agencies are directed to use spyware technology against critical journalists, compromising sources and further endangering the individuals. Foreign agent laws are being introduced to regulate and then criminalize the media. Why do some media accept foreign funds? Because they're denied advertising revenue that would otherwise sustain their work. And if that does not fully silence the media, the rich and powerful and often corrupt use the law courts to smother public interest journalism through vexatious lawsuits, or what are known as slaps. And that is just a situation facing journalists within the European Union, with its rule of law and long tradition long democratic traditions. Today, however, we're going to explore the conditions facing journalists on the front line of the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. We have chosen 3 countries where, in the last few months, as a result of the ever-tightening restrictions imposed on society's basic human rights, we have witnessed sudden explosions of social unrest. In Georgia, Serbia, and most recently Turkey, journalists are put to the ultimate test as they report on the widespread public demonstrations against the respective regimes, braving police violence, intimidation, and arrests to bring the news to the public. Never have journalists been more important, and never have their own fates and freedoms been so closely wrapped up with the outcome of this social struggle. So to explore this issue further, I'm delighted to introduce my panel of speakers. We have Mareta Bobakidze from Georgia, who works at the Eurasia Department for Civil Rights Defenders. We have Özgür Ogret, who is the Turkey representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists in Turkey. And we have Juris Jovanovic, who's manager of the Public Policy Program and Civic Initiatives in Belgrade. So thank you, all three of you. I'd like to turn first of all to Georgia and to Maretta specifically. As part of the work of MFRR, we have a platform called Mapping Media Freedom, where we record media freedom violations across Europe. And since November the 1st, just after the demonstrations began, with the following the elections, disputed elections in Georgia. Since then, we've recorded some 80 different media freedom violations, of which 44 of them have taken place at public demonstrations. 43 of the violations were conducted by state actors. It involved at least 25 violent assaults resulting in injury and 15 arrests of journalists. It's really over to you. If you could please explain to us the story behind those figures, and then also what the build-up was to the story today. Thank you, Maretta.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, colleagues, for joining this webinar, and everybody who is interested to listen to the disturbing developments, not only in Georgia, unfortunately. And indeed, I join your concerns, Oliver, that World Freedom Day is no longer something to celebrate, but rather than being concerned about safety and security of journalists, both in a physical and digital space, and plus increased repression and attempts of silencing independent journalism, especially in Georgia, not to speak about worldwide trend, I would say. When it comes to figures, we have also here the organizations who are trying to track the record, and especially one of the prominent NGOs called Center for Media Information and Social Studies. I have looked at their statistics, and up to date from November 2024, they have recorded 137 incidents, out of which 172 journalists were injured, or their technical facilities or materials were damaged. Some of them were arrested, and recently 25 journalists were fined with 5,000 lari. The story behind this 5,000 lari is that government increased tremendously the fines for just participating in the protests, and one who is participating gets the fine as a traffic fine we get from the police. So one fine day you get fined from police saying that you've been not obedient to the law, which says that you shouldn't protest. Of course, this is not the wording in the law, but even though the journalists have the badges, have their vests, have all the signs that they are representatives of different media outlets, it doesn't save them from being arrested, from being attacked physically or digitally, or being fined. But this is not all. Of course, the government, Georgian Dream Parliament, has fast-tracked adoption of the new restrictive laws targeting independent and critical media. And this includes the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and amendments to the laws on broadcasting and grants. The law on Foreign Agents Registration Act will go into legal force from 1st of June, and this will additionally restrict work of the free media outlets in Georgia. And sadly enough, 2 days ago, one famous TV channel was shut down, absolutely without any plan B when they will, if they will be restored or if they will find another way to broadcast. But we see that there are some ways that individual journalists found, and this is YouTube. So far, unlike other countries, YouTube is still not forbidden in Georgia, and this is the alternative way, so to say, to continue working. Although I must say that YouTube is not that popular, of course, as it was traditional TV channels. So this poses additional risks to free media outlets to continue working and freely broadcast for the protests, especially, and the general situation in the country. I would stop here, and maybe if you have additional questions, I would elaborate more.
Thanks very much, Maretta. I mean, that's already really helpful. I'd be grateful if you could tell us a bit more about the case of Mazia
Yes.
Globelian, who's been in jail, I think, since, is it the 11th of January, and was on hunger strike for at least, I think it was some 5 or 6 weeks. And what is the latest situation facing her?
Indeed, this day cannot be finished or webinar without mentioning Zia Maglobeli, who is the founder of the online news outlets Batumelebi and Net Gazeti. And on April 28th, Batumi City Court Judge Nino Sakhelashvili actually ordered to remain Zia in pretrial detention. Zia has been detained earlier on 11th of January under administrative law, but then just in 1 hour, she was again detained under criminal charges for allegedly slapping a police officer. And she faces imprisonment up to 7 years, which is absolutely insane. And there has been no cases in Georgian judicial or criminal justice system when a person, especially a journalist, and especially female journalist, was ever punished in that severe way. Also, I have to say that the prison itself, where Zia is placed, is in East Georgia, which is around 7-8 hours drive from Batumi, and they are, and you probably can imagine how the prison escort car looks like, detention or a car that accommodates prisoners from prison to the court. And I haven't counted, but it's at least 5 times that Zia have been transported from prison to Batumi City Court, which I would say that equals to torture, because if the person has not ability to be in the small space for so many hours, and just for informing her that she remains into custody in pretrial detention, this could be qualified as a intentional torture and pressure on the journalist, female journalist. And of course, the overall purpose of her detention is to silence everyone who dares to protest, to say a word, and she will be example, or she is always already an example, how government punishes its citizens, and especially female journalists. Yeah, that's a very obvious case. So the consequences of this transportation and court trials, I cannot say that this is a normal court trial. This is absolutely out of justice. There is no sign of impartiality or a fair trial. And for your information, Georgian Young Lawyers Association on the 29th of April appealed Mzia's case to the European Court of Human Rights, citing multiple violations of her rights by the law enforcement. So these are the last updates about Mzia Maglobeli's case.
Okay, thank you for that. And I wonder, could you explain a bit more about the build up to this crisis? Because we've been following the situation in Georgia for some years now. Actually, already this time last year, there was quite a lot of demonstrations, quite a lot of violence taking place, particularly around the first the version of the foreign agents laws that was introduced during the summer, and then of course a new one has just come through over the last couple of weeks, a much stronger and tougher version. So, but if you could talk a bit more about the sort of the context of the media freedom and the build up to this political social crisis in Georgia.
Yes, well, the adoption of the draconic laws are taking place over 2 years now already in Georgia. In 2023, the government initiated so-called foreign agents law, but then the civil society and the whole population of Georgia were really vocal, and we could oblige them to withdraw the law from the parliament, and it was not adopted in 2023, which was later on followed by the government with initiation of the law on foreign influence. So they have changed the wording and initiated new legislation in 2024. But as everybody is aware, we had parliamentary elections in October 2024, and everybody, including international society and local monitoring organizations, election monitoring organizations, declared it invalid, and that election was stolen, including OSCE ODIHR's observation said the same. And there are a number of evidence how the technology was used to falsify the elections, unfortunately. But government did not agree with this decision. Of course, the opposition parties, they remain into boycott. They didn't enter the parliament. But suddenly the prime minister at that time announced that they are canceling the membership path to European Union and postponing it until 2030. This crazy announcement caused a lot of civil unrest, and demonstrations are ever since ongoing. So it's today marks 155th day that there are ongoing protests in Tbilisi, in Kutaisi, in Batumi, and some small cities occasionally. But in Tbilisi, Batumi, and Kutaisi, the protest has been ongoing, continuous. Meanwhile, government adopted the law on foreign influence, and only 5% of the NGOs registered, but this was all. In practice, government couldn't implement any restrictive measures, and they saw that the non-governmental organizations, including media organizations, they were continuing their ordinary work. So I guess this was the trigger for them to initiate FARA and also to initiate the amendment into the law on grants. Now, if you want to issue the grant in Georgia or to fund a Georgian media organization or any other organization, then the donor or grant issuer must seek approval from the Georgian government before issuing a grant to a Georgian organization. So if the grant recipient accepts funding without approval, they will be fined double the amount of the grant. The Anti-Corruption Bureau is granted additional powers, including the ability to request financial reports from individuals and conduct interviews. The Bureau will be also authorized to request special category personal data from public institutions, individuals, and legal entities. So if you fail to comply with this law, then the fine amounts to 10,000 lari or imprisonment. So these are the restrictions imposed by the FARA, but this is not all. There have been amendments to the law on broadcasting. So on April 1st, 2025, Georgian Dream passed amendments to the law on broadcasting, and according to the amendments, foreign funding of broadcasters was completely banned, and the powers of the regulatory body, the National Communications Commission, were significantly expanded, specifically bringing journalistic professional activity under the regulatory scope. The amended law prohibits broadcasters from receiving direct and indirect funding from the so-called foreign power, and also bans the purchase of broadcasters' services by foreign powers, except in the case of advertisements or product placement. And under these changes, broadcasters are prohibited from receiving any form of direct or indirect funding in exchange for airing social advertisements. The amendments also introduced detailed regulations concerning TV and radio broadcasting standards, including provisions on factual accuracy, the right to reply, and additional regulations concerning fairness and impartiality, the inviolability of private life, gathering and transmitting information using covert methods, coverage of armed conflicts, accidents, and other emergencies, as well as specific provisions for the protection of minors. So what they couldn't do with the so-called Russian law, they could impose through FARA, through amendments into the law on grants, law on public broadcaster or broadcasters in general, and law on protection of minors and family values. And speaking about the law on protection of minors and family values, this is a total censorship. It not covers only LGBTI community at all. It covers the whole society and broad range of the fields like education, film, cinema, anything actually. So it's a total censorship law, and it has been evaluated by the lawyers a lot of times, and there has been discussions. And recently, I don't remember who, but somebody from the Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, has submitted the initiation to prohibit rainbow colors and all the attributes or accessories associated to that.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. I mean, that's a very, very thorough and a very chilling account, actually, of the new laws that are coming through. I don't think I've heard quite such an extensive form of foreign agent law, quite such tight regulation. I mean, my immediate question, just very quickly before we go on to Eurus, is very quickly, how dependent are the, if you say, independent media or the non-pro-government media, how dependent are they on foreign funds, or what are the consequences if they cannot access them?
Oh, thank you for that question. Actually, yeah, very dependent, I would say, in 2 words. And I have said it or underlined it when I started this webinar, and I will repeat it, that and this law is already into legal force, but plus FARA will be into force in 1 month, then it will be extremely difficult for independent media outlets to remain.
So we can anticipate the collapse of the
Absolute
sort of
collapse.
independent
I
media sector.
have
That's very frightening.
already told you that some of the journalists, they found a way to transform their materials into YouTube, but it's not sufficient, of course, especially if we take into consideration the access to internet in the remote areas or in the mountainous areas of Georgia, also the access to devices by the general public, especially elderly population. We cannot rely on YouTube. And also we can anticipate that at some point, YouTube is also restricted, as it happened in many other countries. So this is a kind of temporary solution, but in a long run, it will be a deep crisis for Georgian independent journalists. And if I have 2 minutes, I wanted
Very
to
quickly,
say,
because we are
yeah,
running short.
I wanted to just highlight one human story about Vasil Ivanov Chikovani, who was an anchor of a public broadcaster. And he was recently dismissed after serving there for ages. And the reason was that he was starting every news by saying solidarity to Mzia Maglobeli, and I demand freedom for Mzia Maglobeli. So every time he started news or presenting news, he was saying these words, and this was the major reason that why he was dismissed from the public broadcaster, which is one of the free channels for government to spread the propaganda, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for that, Moretta. That's great, and hopefully we'll have time to come back to you as well towards the end. Just to the audience, if you want to, we hope to have a little bit of time for questions at the end. If you want to pose a question, put it in the Q&A button, and we should be able to find it on our screens here. Okay, I'd like to now turn to Eurus. I mean, look, you've heard about the situation in Georgia. We don't necessarily have to ask if Serbia is worse or better or different, but it seems that you're going through a very similar process. Again, if I just look at the statistics on MMF, we've got some over 90 different incidents that have been recorded again since the collapse of the railway station's roof in Novi Sad back in the beginning of November. So over 90 violations, including some 17 different assaults and 25 different digital kinds of threats, and 21 during demonstrations. These are very sort of superficial figures, but I'm sure you can tell us much more. What is behind the story? We know that the demonstrations are still very much in swing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Yes, we are going into the Georgian direction, but we aren't there yet. For 13 years, we've been recording a steadily increasing number of attacks on journalists. And I will maybe start with some statistics. For example, data coming from the Independent Journalists Association of Serbia. From 31 recorded cases of attacks on journalists in 2012, we have reached 184 cases in 2023 and 166 in 2024. And now we have the current developments in Serbia and the heightened repression against anyone who dares to speak critically of the ruling party. Now, in the first 4 months of 2025, we are already at 116 attacks already. And these include 13 physical assaults, 2 attacks on property, 1 threat to property, 68 cases of pressure, and 38 verbal attacks. And this is the data coming from the Independent Journalists Association of Serbia, which runs a database, a publicly available database on attacks on journalists. So let's start with this. So journalists have always been exposed to verbal and physical attacks while, for example, reporting from high-risk gatherings. And by high-risk gatherings, I mean events organized by the ruling Serbian Progressive Party, controlled de facto by Aleksandar Vučić, the president of everything in the country. For example, during coverage of a rally organized by this party in a smaller Serbian town a year back, a journalist from N1 television, so one of the few remaining outlets not under the ruling party's influence, was subjected to death threats by party sympathizers and supporters. And just a few days ago, a journalist in Novi Sad, the second largest Serbian city and the city where the collapse of the train station happened that killed 16 people, that journalist was physically assaulted by members of the special police forces despite wearing a vest clearly marked with, press. So, and finally, instead of ensuring that journalists can safely report from, such high-risk gatherings, the police just surrounds them under the pretext of providing them protection, only to then politely ask them to move outside of the perimeter of the event because they cannot guarantee their safety. They'll be safe outside. And we have been witnessing this for years, and the situation is only worse year by year. And for 13 consecutive years, I'm highlighting 13 because that's how many years the party has been in power, we have been observing the top state and top party officials who, rather than responding to journalists' questions, use their platforms to verbally attack, humiliate, dehumanize journalists in every conceivable way, including discrediting the media they work for. And any question that is perceived as critical is instantly dismissed. Journalists are branded as enemies who hate the ruling party's politicians, that their work is framed as extremely biased, And alongside this smear campaign run by top state officials, there is a parallel smear campaign carried out by pro-government tabloids and pro-government, pro-ruling party aligned media. So this is a continuous daily campaign of insults, humiliation, dehumanization, public labeling of critical voices, and journalists as enemies of the state. And it should come as no surprise that, for example, a ruling party supporter might approach a N1 journalist and, issue death threats. Why would that individual think twice about doing so, when they are openly encouraged by the president of the country himself, who attacks journalists on a daily basis? And why should the police even consider protecting journalists when they have been so deeply dehumanized that they are seen as easy targets, for physical assault? So the freedom to express oneself here in the country, to assemble, to associate, has been eroded to the core. Civic initiatives are recording attacks on all of these three fundamental freedoms. So we count journalists and human rights defenders. In 2024, we have documented 234 such cases of attacks on fundamentals. And in the first 4 months of this year, we are already at 214. So we are already at the number that is the sum for the last year. And okay, I pointed to the political actors and to those pro-government, pro-ruling party propaganda megaphones, let's say it like that. And finally, let's say a word about institutions. Serbia does not have an independent media regulator. So the previous composition of the Council of the National Electronic Media Regulator was aligned with the ruling party, systematically ignored violations of media legislation by pro-government outlets. And in fact, the leading figure of the regulator, whose name I really wish to state explicitly so that it remains recorded from this event, Olivera Zekic, openly justified the conduct of pro-government media, engaged in confrontations with critics of her work. And even though she's not a member of the regulator anymore, she was hired to serve as the PR of the regulator now. So she still continues, to spill poison, attack students, discredit media. She is still there, showing up on televisions. She and, of course, other members of the media regulator allocated 4 national frequencies, again, to televisions, which have a history of breaking laws, all codes of conduct of journalistic associations. They managed to postpone the allocation of the 5th and final frequency, which otherwise would have gone to maybe some of the few independent TV stations left in the country. And this kind of impunity enables pro-government tabloids and media to, thrive and expand rapidly. And that's what we've seen over the years here in Serbia. And right now, we have an election for the new council of the regulator underway after the previous election cycle, just last year, which was annulled, was full of irregularity. So the government, the ruling party, again, tried to push their own people into the regulator. So Civic Initiatives was monitoring that process. 17 out of 34 candidates to serve as new members of the council, and 32 out of 121 proposers of candidates did not meet the criteria set in law. In the final round of choosing candidates to be proposed to the parliamentary plenary for election, 10 candidates from 32 illegitimate proposers were on the list. And because of those irregularities, 7 out of 18 candidates that were, supported by civil society, that really had biographies and to be independent members and so on, withdrew their applications, which of course led to the process in the first cycle to stop. And to look in for the coming months, I'm not that optimistic. So alongside increasing intense attacks on journalists, the authorities are also targeting and restricting the institutional framework necessary for their work. We don't have independent mechanisms. The judiciary and the state apparatus are completely captured. What could be a turning point? An independent regulator. That's what also the students also identified that maybe as a first step. It came to a shock to us because we couldn't anticipate what's going to happen in the next 30 days here in Serbia since the protest started. So maybe I wouldn't go that much in the future. I would maybe stick to the media regulator as the first step, being independent as the first step for moving in a more positive direction, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you, Euros. And again, that's another excellent sort of overview of all of the events. You talked about the violence and the harassment and the smearing of journalists trying to report on the demonstrations. You've also put it in the sort of broader regulatory environment where media are denied, I don't know, broadcast licenses, or they're demoted on the sort of choice list of provided by cable operators. We know the role of Telecom, which owns several media. So it's sort of basically a state-controlled company that owns certain media and can use that to influence the editorial output of those media. And he talks about how, this is classic sort of media capture strategy where the government place their allies into the regulatory bodies. You talked about REM, the media regulator, and use that to abuse, to punish independent media, independent journalism, and obviously to promote the interests of government allies in the media. It's really interesting. You also talked about how pro-government media are used as part of the propaganda outputs. And one of the things we've seen in Serbia is how, we've had demonstrations against independent media taking place, pro-government demonstrations outside independent, and we've also seen counter demonstrations outside RTS, the public broadcaster, outside some of the other sort of pro-government media. And also touching on what Loretta talked about in the Georgian public broadcaster, we also see within the public broadcasters some journalists trying to resist the propaganda. and being punished as a consequence. I wonder if you could sort of comment a bit more on those connections.
Yes, we are all somehow emotionally attached to the national broadcaster. I mean, it's there. It doesn't look like the tabloids and TV stations that are directly influenced by the ruling party, but it has always kept some sense of, an appearance of professionalism. Well, for example, presenting news, but still, it is deeply into self-censorship, avoiding any critical question to the government. And if there was a situation where the national broadcaster reported on the protest organized by students for a few minutes, and then instantly the ruling party issued a statement condemning the national broadcaster for siding with the students, And during the blockade of the national broadcaster by the students, a part of the national broadcaster staff also joined the blockades and also joined the protest, demanding independent broadcasting from the editorial offices. And the students succeeded. I mean, the main demand of the students was for the parliamentary committee responsible for the national media regulator to call elections for new members, which they did on Monday. They reset the whole process and the students withdrew immediately. What's going to happen right now? I think what the students managed is to wake up that part of the national broadcaster that wants to resist that ruling party influence or the national broadcaster. Now we saw the staff on protests. We'll see if the staff is going to continue organizing, within the national broadcaster.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Uros. Reminder to the audience, we've got one question in the Q&A. Please put more questions in. I will come back to those once after we've talked to Özge. Özge, please welcome. Thank you for being so patient. Okay, look, the current round of social unrest in Turkey is much more recent, ever since the arrest of the Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, just over a month ago. I wonder, of course, that's one in the latest, I suppose, of examples of often widespread demonstrations that take place in Turkey. I think going back all the way to the Gezi protests of 2013, the crackdown against Turkish media after the failed coup 2016. Is this the equivalent to those sorts of moments in Turkey? Perhaps you could give us some more information about what has happened and why it's happened.
Thank you, Oliver. While comparing the recent civil unrest to the previous examples may be misleading, but I can say that what has happened last month after the detention and the following arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, as you mentioned, who's seen as a potential challenger to the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the next presidential race, by the way. What has happened since then is a very good set of examples of the variety and the volume of the press freedom violations in Turkey, with detentions, deportations, journalists being beaten, gassed, and threatened by the security agents, and also government censorship was applied to the broadcasters. Well, we have observed that 14 journalists were taken into police custody, 9 of them at their houses raided by the terrorism police in the middle of the night. And one journalist, BBC's Mark Lowen, was deported, and one journalist, Swedish journalist Joakim Medim, remains under arrest. Actually, his trial starts tomorrow. Regarding these events, I want to underline a few things about the house rates. This is almost a standard procedure for the government to raid journalist houses, not with one or two police, but with a whole squad with armed gear and guns, as if they are dangerous criminals. As a part of a smear campaign against the journalists, portraying them terrorists or such. What was different about this time was we see these kinds of raids targeting on a single journalist or a journalist working for a specific outlet or two. This time, the journalists who were taken into custody by house raids in Istanbul and Izmir were photojournalists. Some of them were freelancers, some of them were not, but they were not working for single organizations. And while we are unfortunately accustomed to these kinds of practices due to terrorism-related investigations, these journalists were arrested, later released, but now facing trial for violating the law on protests and demonstrations. Now, this sends a very clear message that these journalists were harassed, arrested, and now facing trial for doing their jobs. Apart from that, we need to underline that it's a persistent problem in Turkey that the security forces are not often, but always hostile to field reporters. This includes insults, threats, shooting them with rubber bullets, gassing them, and at the very least, obstructing them from doing their jobs while covering social events. And I always say this is the easiest press freedom problem of Turkey that can be solved. One circular letter from Ankara to the police chiefs would end this problem. Do not bother the journalists at the field. But unfortunately, we are not seeing that kind of mentality from the Turkish government. And as I mentioned, the deportation of BBC's Mark Lowen and the arrest of Swedish journalist Joakim Medin it can be considered as a clear message to foreign journalists. I do not normally like to speculate things, but this is very clearly telling foreign reporters that you wouldn't be treated differently than domestic reporters, and especially the arrest of Joakim Medin is a clear sign of threat. Apart from that, Ebu Bekir Şahin, the government-appointed chair of the media regulator RTÜK, threatened to revoke the broadcast licenses of Turkish TV channels that are covering the protests and opposition rallies. And unfortunately, to an extent, this also worked and should be seen as one of the clear evidence of government censorship because the RTÜK, the media regulator, does not have the authority to pre-censor the content. That this was the regulator can monitor and judge the broadcasted content, but here the government's appointed chair of the regulator openly pre-censored the broadcast media. Also, we had injuries. The local press freedom advocate groups monitored that from March 21 to 23, at least 14 journalists were either beaten, shot by rubber bullets, or exposed to tear gas. We can very confidently say that the actual number would be quite higher, because not every incident goes into record, and sometimes reporters do not want to go into record with these injuries, with fear of further being targeted by the authorities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Oscar. I mean, again, that's you've raised a whole range of points, and I think the role of RUTUK is central, and it's been fining the sort of independent broadcast media almost on a monthly basis since the last sort of 3 or 4 years, as far as we can tell, with different levels of fines, not necessarily very high, but if it's cumulatively over every month, this obviously adds up, and the instructions that come out from the head of the chair of RUTUK at the start of those public demonstrations to tell broadcast media that they cannot report anything that may be perceived as giving voice to the demonstrators was a clear act of censorship and a threat. And it's interesting you raised the case of Joakim Medin, the Swedish journalist, who I think today is facing his first court hearing for having accused of insult against the president. He's also facing terrorism-related charges. I mean, yes, it also seems a bit like Mazir. An example is being made of him. On one level, as you point out, what he is experiencing is no different from what Turkish journalists have been experiencing, not just in these last weeks, but for the last sort of 10 years, sort of regular judicial harassment of prosecuting journalists. Not because the journalist has done anything wrong, but because the prosecution itself is a form of punishment. And quite often at the end of the trial, journalists are sort of found not guilty or released or given a suspended sentence. They're not actually jailed, but it's that process of prosecution that has been so debilitating for media. So yes, on the one hand, Joachim is, he's just a foreign journalist who's going through the same things as everybody else, other journalists. On the other hand, an example is being made of him as a foreign journalist, a particular warning shot. And so it's clear that this is, a warning to everybody, including the international community. And I want to come back to you because we haven't got very long. But one of the elements that are central to this, it seems to be also the relationships between the government and the European Union. And I'm very conscious, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we are, since the new administration in charge of the United States has taken charge, it does appear that there is a breakdown in the sort of international rule-based system, and a sense that authoritarian or would-be authoritarian regimes seem to have a license to start taking actions either against journalists or against civil society more at large, and to be free to do that without any consequences, certainly in terms of their relationship with the United States. That should be less so with the European Union, but I wonder, have you sensed a weakening of the commitment from the European Union to come in and have their voices heard? Have you, or do you think that they're doing what you would expect, or the most that they can do? I wonder how you sense, does this represent a significant turning point in the way we deal with these crises because of the change of the international rules-based order? I will go, but let's go backwards. I'll go to Oscar first, and then.
Well, of course, nothing happens in a vacuum. What's happening in Turkey is, I believe, closely related to US President Donald Trump's policies, foreign policies regarding Europe and also Turkey. I believe the current situation brings Turkey, will bring Turkey and Europe much closer in many aspects. However, this relationship should not be strengthened at the cost of press freedom and basic rights in Turkey. So far, Europe has reacted to the developments in Turkey. However, as somebody who has been monitoring press freedom problems of Turkey in the past 15 years or so, the level of reactions and their desired effect, the level of reactions is not there, and their desired effects is virtually unseen in terms of press freedom, unfortunately.
Okay, so even when they do make statements, the impact is not as great. Is that the same in Serbia, Euros? I mean, has the EU taken sufficiently strong positions? Is it listened to by the government?
No strong position. There was a slight, but not enough change in the official statements by the European Union, letters and so on. What the government of Serbia does is constantly changing laws, but we have no change in practice. And there was one meeting of the parliamentary committee. The subject was the reform agenda. We were so disappointed that in the whole reform agenda, there were only 2 indicators on fundamentals related to freedom of expression. And one of the indicators contained changing the 3 media laws in Serbia. So I raised my hand asking Serbian committee representatives and the minister, why do you not include indicators from the national media strategy? For example, if Serbia fulfills 80% of the media strategy indicators, then you can withdraw the funds allocated to you under that indicator in the reform agenda. But the European Commission, the European Union always buys that story. We are changing laws, we are making the situation better, but it's not happening. We have such a huge gap between, laws, what's written on paper and what's happening in practice, but still no strong, statements that would work things out in practice has come from the European Union. We haven't had much intervention or messages from the American administration. But what is interesting is that the American administration under Trump, the first and the second one, has always been praised here by the populist ruling party, pro-government tabloids. It is a particular weight referring to the most powerful people in the world, when the government tries to have pretexts on doing crackdowns on civil society, for example. Referring to Trump and Musk calling USA, for example, a criminal organization is a perfect pretext to go on full crackdown on civil society, which happened in Serbia. We had police raids on 5 civil society organizations, fully armed police officers, like we are the worst criminals ever in this country, copying papers, breaking laws, mimicking the search procedure, and referring to some other procedures from the criminal procedure code that deals with gathering intelligence on, criminal misconduct. I mean, come on. No messages from the American administration and no particular change from the EU. We'll see. We have the EU Commissioner for Enlargement currently in Serbia. She was in meetings with the president and with the president of the government, and she's having meetings with civil society. She went to Novi Sad, where the tragedy happened. So we'll see if some change might happen in the future, but currently it is what it is.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it does seem that the change of policy coming out of Washington has made media and civil society actors more broadly much more vulnerable. Thank you, Maretta. We've got about 1 minute left. So, but of course, the demonstrations in Georgia started after the announcement of the freezing of negotiations with the EU. So I was wondering, has the EU done what it can do? Is it living up to its promises, or is there more that can be done?
There is always room for improvements and for more to be done. And indeed, EU and other European organizations, they have been quite supportive to Georgian media and civil society organizations, but we need more pressure on the government, more sanctions probably on the individuals, not to the citizens of Georgia, like, for example, depriving us from a visa-free regime, but targeting sanctions to the ones who are responsible for violating the Constitution of Georgia, which says that Georgia strives to join the EU, and it no longer happens. But I also must say that Trump's current administration definitely was a gift to the current Georgian and illegitimate government, because they use the similar terminology like deep state, public enemy, USAID funding agents, and so on. And I must also admit that by that narrative in Azerbaijan, several journalists funded by USAID were already arrested. So we should be, I mean, European Union and European organizations should be prepared for worse scenarios, and should support Georgian media outlets or Georgian civil society organizations to be more resilient, more resourced with finances, and advocating for international, for voicing up our problems internationally. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marissa. Well, I mean, thank you once again. The rest of the World Press Freedom Day celebrations are actually taking place in Brussels next week, and there I think the city will be full of media freedom advocates and journalists, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to press home all of those messages that you've just said. A quick apology to Sasha Dobrijevic. Your question about cyber attacks. And it not turn into an alert, please contact MFRR directly, and we will examine the case and then probably turn it into an alert on our site. So please do that. Coming up over the next few days, MFRR will also be publishing 2 reports. One report on Turkey after a mission that I conducted with my friend Özgür back in November. Will be presenting that report in Brussels next week. And MFRR has also completed its mission to Serbia 2 weeks ago, and the report is in the final process and will also be launched on Friday. So look out for those. Thank you once again to the panelists, and thank you to the audience who tuned in. Have a great afternoon.